The Second Coming by Emily Tackett and Mason Upton.
The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight somewhere in sands of the desert. A shape with lion body and the head of a man. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs while all about real shadows of the indigenous desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know the 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hours come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Author's background. William Butler Yeats was an Irish writer through the late 19th century and the start of the 20th. Writing poetry, prose, and plays, he was born in Ireland yet spent most of his childhood in London, England, despite a strong claim to his Irish nationality. He started his writing career at 17, mostly writing poems about Irish folklore and supernatural. He later moved into more serious poetry towards the turn of the century, using ordinary symbolism and less mystique.
Type of poem. The Second Coming is written with no clear rhyme pattern, but with a consistent meter that is roughly an iambic pentameter. The idea of an iambic pentameter is to replicate the rhythm of a heartbeat, putting stress on certain syllables, and having mostly 10 syllables in a line. In The Second Coming, we can see the iambic pentameter pattern with even the first word, turning, with the stress on turn. So this poem can be broken up into two parts. The first half of the poem, which is 8 lines, and the second half, which is 14. So this first half of the poem can be seen as a description of how the world currently is, saying things like, things are falling apart, mere anarchy, innocence is drowning, and the blood-dimmed tide is loosened and everywhere. This is a commentary on how horrible the world currently is, and this first paragraph creates an image of chaos and terror in the reader's mind. Things are falling apart, mere anarchy, innocence is drowning, and the blood-dimmed tide is loosened and everywhere. This is a commentary on how horrible the world currently is, and this first paragraph creates an image of chaos and terror in the reader's mind. The second half of the poem, however, is where the title of the poem really comes from, The Second Coming. After describing all the bad in the world, Yeats then states, surely a second coming is at hand, meaning the return of a Messiah is coming. But this Messiah is not necessarily Jesus. Instead, Yeats states, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So there's many symbols within the poem. There's this idea of a widening gyre. And gyre is something that is some sort of vertex, either in the air or in the ocean. Its representation in the poem symbolizes the movement of the land and society, and how history keeps turning and turning. In the first paragraph, Yeats talks about this gyre and how things are falling apart. This is supposed to symbolize the world falling apart and the need for a second coming. The falconer. Yeats also mentions a falconer, saying, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. This is supposed to represent a higher power, like God, and how the falcon looks down on society and what has happened to it. So a more in-depth look at the first stanza. In the first stanza, we can see a few examples of opposites within the poem, and on the screen they are highlighted with a color underneath. So we have the falcon and the falconer. We also have fall apart and hold, anarchy compared to innocence, and best compared to worst. So the negatives are usually way more powerful than the positive, which already starts this poem off as very pessimistic. There's tons of biblical allusions in this poem. It's not just the title. Anarchy, in line 4, Yeats states, mere anarchy, when referring to the current state of the world. This can be seen as the reign of the devil or Satan, and the anarchy it creates. It is well known in the Bible that before the Messiah or Jesus can come back, there needs to be cause on earth. By stating anarchy, Yeats is setting the reader up for what is to come, the second coming. Bethlehem. In the last line of the poem, Yeats states, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. This is a very clear reference to Jesus since he was born in Bethlehem. Allusions to Noah's Ark. So along with those biblical allusions, there is an allusion to Noah's Ark saying the ceremony of innocence is drowned. This can be a reference to Noah's Ark when the wicked people were drowned in this idea of a post-apocalyptic world after all this chaos.
Historical context. This poem was published in 1920, only a year after World War I ended. At this time, the world was left in absolute disarray from the war, and most Europeans just wanted to move on with their lives. Many new nations began to form, but there was a sense of coming violence. Although Yeats wrote this poem as an almost prophecy of the future violence, his prediction was ultimately true after the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party during the 1930s.
Literary devices. Allusions. Within the poem, there's many biblical and historical allusions. Even the title itself is a biblical allusion to the rebirth of Jesus. Imagery. There's multiple uses of imagery in the second coming. One example is a shape with lion body and the head of a man, somewhere in the sands off the desert. This is a very descriptive image about the new Messiah and what it looks like.
Some more literary devices that are used in the second coming is hyperbole and alliteration. A hyperbole is an exaggeration of the truth in a literary work. It is used in the second coming when in the 10th line it's stated, surely the second coming is at hand, as if the beast is about to just enter the world. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds in the same line. It's used in poems to grab the reader's attention and also add a pleasing sound to the poem's meter. Yeats uses alliteration at 2 points in the poem, when he states, trouble my sight, somewhere in sand of the, using the S sound, and the darkness drops again, but now I know, using the N sound.
Reaction. I thought this poem was very eye-opening because of how many connections can be made to it from historical events. While it was wrote in regards to humanity after the ending of World War I in post-revolution Russia, it can still pertain to many tragedies such as 9/11 right after the first tower hit and before the second, or the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. I also found it very insightful how Yeats used multiple biblical references such as Bethlehem and Noah's Ark to create imagery of a post-apocalyptic world and the theme of rebirth to a new world.
The first question is, consider both the speaker and the imagery in the first 8 lines. How do the images help create the persona of the speaker? How are the speaker and the imagery different in the last 14 lines? So in the first 8 lines, there's images of violence and destruction, with things such as anarchy, blood dim, darkness drop, and nightmare. The speaker is looking at this from a perspective where he can see all the bad that is going on in the world. But then in the last 14 lines, he talks about what is to come and this idea of a second coming, and uses images to describe what the new Messiah will look like in the future.
In the line, the falcon cannot hear the falconeer represents Christ while the falcon is humanity. Both are used to symbolize that humanity is lost without the higher power of God.
Question 3 asks, what is the effect of the repetition of Lucen in lines 4 and 5, and surely in lines 9 and 10? Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Notice how these lines are almost exactly the same. There's just one word that's different. The speaker is telling us what he thinks is going on, but the repetition might mean that he's not so sure and he's slowly trying to figure it out. Saying, surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand? It might be more of a question rather than emphasis. On the other hand, the repetition of loosen in lines 4 and 5 is really to emphasize this effect that the world is a complete disaster, that things are very loose and nothing's really concrete anymore. The next question is, describe the tone of the poem. How is it created? So this poem is very pessimistic, but it's also very reflective on what is currently going on in the world and how the world is in complete disarray and distress. So he does this by creating these images that the reader can really identify, and his word choice and just the subject matter itself. It can make a reader feel moody or worried about what the world is currently like, but then when he draws into the second coming, he isn't necessarily hopeful, but it's a little bit different than the pessimistic side in the first 8 lines.
Yeats ends the poem with a question in order to leave the reader pondering and slightly fearing the second coming. Especially in the time period of the early 20th century, it was written when the world was in great turmoil from the events of World War I, and the question of the end shows that we don't know what danger may be inflicted in the future. Cohn makes a statement that Yeats' poem lacks conviction. I agree with this because he lacks credibility when it comes to war and the other serious subject matters of his poems. I agree with Cohn because while the author is passionate, he lacks the professional background to speak publicly about such topics, being a writer of mostly fairy tales. I also feel that politics have no place in fictional literature.